you hear about Rian Johnson coming to him and saying, we want to do a puppet version of Yoda, we want to do the original Yoda. And it was actually Frank Oz who expressed real pessimism and doubt about their ability to pull it off. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another Casually Creative. And this is basically just my chance to kind of spark a discussion on something that I've sort of noticed, either a trend in the industry or something that I think is affecting filmmakers and YouTubers basically right now. I wanted to talk about basically the future of animation today. I think we've seen a lot of technology developments and changes in technology over the last even just few months that indirectly I think are going to have a profound effect on animation. And I feel like there's been a lot of discussion recently about how using, for example, audio replication technology or even facial recognition and replication technology with CGI could basically create kind of fake news or allow people to fake anything through video, and that it's just destroying the credibility of film and video as evidence of actual events, as historical documentation. To an extent, I think that's absolutely going to happen, but I think what's going to happen a lot sooner is an absolute massive shakeup in the animation industry by basically the same technology being used for entertainment purposes. Lyrebird is one of these technologies, for example, that's claiming that they can replicate anyone's voice with just 1 minute of sample audio. So could an actor, a famous actor, a celebrity, basically just sell a sample kit of audio that allows a studio to replicate their voice with any other voice actor as a hypothetical? Or, could at the very least studios do any of the ADR, additional dialogue that might not have been scripted, without actually calling in the actor? That's just one example of, how an animation studio might use this technology to drive down costs dramatically. But much, much, much more profound than the audio side, which is already relatively cheap, of course, is the visual side. And when we see things like Apple's Animoji, or I think Samsung, their equivalent is called AR emoji. If you haven't seen these things, it's basically kind of the evolution of the Snapchat filters that are applied to somebody's face. But rather than just putting things over the image, it's actually transforming the video footage live to transform somebody into a cartoon. Right now it's just used for cartoons, but of course it could be adapted to a much more realistic style, or even potentially to mimic somebody else's actual facial features and expressions. Pretty crazy stuff, and it's really just sort of a gimmick right now, maybe a blip in terms of a social media trend, something that could potentially replace emojis is sort of the way people are looking at it. I think that's not giving it nearly enough credit. Not to say that specifically Animoji or AR emoji or any of these other apps are going to really influence the way that we use social media, but certainly the underlying technology is. And not just for social media, but I think for the entertainment industry at large. You have to wonder how many CGI studios, particularly ones focused on CGI 3D animated kids movies, are looking at this technology. And I'm not so much talking about Pixar here, although that could be, Pixar has its own proprietary animation software already. They might have already invested in some of this kind of technology. But I'm more thinking about smaller studios, people who create, for example, TV specials or TV series for young children on a relatively low budget with, high turnover rate. They're creating a lot of content. Or even here on YouTube, even after Elsagate, there's still a lot of animators who are focusing on creating family entertainment on YouTube. And it's a real struggle for them to create full-blown animations from scratch. They need to find shortcuts. They need to find ways to save time. All those folks are going to be looking at things like Animoji and wondering how they can integrate it or a very similar technology into their production workflow. And it is starting to happen too on the industry level. For example, Adobe, which creates very accessible consumer level kind of software, their character animator software is starting to be used by professional studios, and we've seen that in like live TV broadcasts and demos where they basically do live animation. And news commentary, for example, in front of a live audience, like a talk show, is a great example of a good application for that. But I think character animator, just as one example, is starting to be used much more broadly in the animation industry for TV right now, and potentially for feature films in the future. If you don't know what character animator is, similar to Animoji, it recognizes the facial features and the lip movements of a voice reader and basically applies that to an animated illustrated character that you import into the software from something like Photoshop or Illustrator. And it does it all live and seamlessly. And then you can also create keyboard shortcuts to trigger other kind of pre-developed, pre-animated gestures and movements. But those movements, even the walk cycles and everything, are basically programmatically created in Character Animator before the illustrator, before the actual artist or the voice actor even opens up the software. And there's potentially infinite degrees of customization, but it's still a far cry from animation, even CGI animation, where you're physically, literally moving and creating key points and keyframes. I'm not describing it very well, but instead of like a traditional animation where you have, loops that are crafted and created to kind of come together at, a rest pose or a key position, you have something much more like a video game where everything is programmatic. And obviously for creative folks, this is incredibly exciting. How many people always wanted to do some kind of animation, always wanted to tell a story that was bigger than something they could afford to do through live action, but they just didn't have the time, they didn't have the resources, they didn't have the experience, the skill, and they weren't able to hire somebody to do the actual physical animation. And you can imagine it's only a matter of time before there are virtually no barriers except the imagination in terms of bringing to life stories that go way beyond the limitations of the real world. That's very exciting. Also, it's also a little worrying, and again, besides the worry about the kind of fake news debate, for me, the fear is just what implications does it have for animators and other creators who are really good at creating organic, true, hand-drawn or individualized kind of animation from scratch that have perfected that art form, because it's not identical. This is not really a true replacement for that. It's always going to be somewhat watered down. So for example, this isn't actually animation, but recently Frank Oz, you can find probably an interview, I think they're just coming out kind of right now, but Frank Oz, the original puppeteer behind Yoda and a great animator from the Jim Henson Company and also a accomplished film director, recently came out and kind of described his involvement in Star Wars The Last Jedi and reprising the non-CGI, the true puppet version or the original puppet version of Yoda after many years of him being a CGI character. And Frank Oz is an example of someone who has this incredible unique skill and discipline that isn't really being trained anymore, isn't being taught, isn't a viable career for a lot of people in traditional puppetry, but he's a true master of it. He does it better than anyone. And it's a little bit, there's a tinge of sadness when you hear about Rian Johnson coming to him and saying, we want to do a puppet version of Yoda, we want to do the original Yoda. And it was actually Frank Oz who expressed real pessimism and doubt about their ability to pull it off. He had to be convinced, and this is somebody who absolutely has dedicated their life, built their career on this sort of filmmaking technique. And they're the ones who are making the reality check and kind of discouraging the studio from going this route. And Frank Oz has said, it's a miracle that they pulled it off in The Last Jedi, and that's a happy ending. But the truth is, even if they did, for example, a Yoda spin-off movie, which there's a real potential to do, Frank Oz is saying he can't see them making that financially viable to actually do the traditional puppet movement for Yoda for, a movie where he's on screen so much. And that's not stop motion animation frame by frame. It's still really intensive. You're hiring at least 4 puppeteers every time the puppet's moving. I'm sure many, many hundreds, if not thousands of man hours, definitely thousands of man hours to create the actual original puppets, and then all kinds of special crew required to kind of look over the maintenance of the puppet, to create different puppets for different sorts of movements, potentially even create entire sets built around different puppets for different scales and applications. So it's a huge expense. But you have to wonder, now that animation is increasingly programmatic, sort of what's the next technique to go? In the mainstream, we've lost stop motion as a technique for special effects in live action movies. Stop motion, there's really only 1 or 2 traditional stop motion movies that come to theaters every year if we're lucky. 2D animation seems like there's even more scarce. Puppets barely used in the live action sense. And you have to wonder kind of with programmatic animation, what's next to go? Conceivably, there will be a time when even studios like Pixar are struggling to justify not using automated automated animation techniques or programmatic animation. And the reason it's a problem is because it's simply not the same and it will never be the same. Even if it absolutely perfectly mimics live action, if we want to see an example of this in the past, there's a technique called rotoscoping, which is virtually tracing frame by frame live action footage. And this is the sort of technique popularized by Ralph Bakshi, who did like the original The Lord of the Rings animated movies. And those movies are incredible. I love them. I love the animation, but it's definitely a very different look, right? It's not Disney. It's not Don Bluth. The characters are more realistic and to an extent less lifelike. I think one of the greatest joys of animation, one of the true arts of animation, and some of the best art in animation is exaggerating, stretching and pulling and changing the personalization of the individual characters. It's like creating the quirks that these characters have that are things that couldn't even exist in real life, but express in different terms, sometimes in louder, more prominent, more organic, more lively terms even than real actors could ever express certain emotions, by choosing what to accentuate and what to remove altogether, what's simply not required to convey a certain emotion, and focusing on what really has the biggest impact. And at the end of the day, I think these are the things that made Walt Disney take off, made Pixar take off, Aardman Animations, Ghibli, any of the big successful creative studios. If you look at their characters, it almost doesn't matter what type of creature it is, whether it's a person or an animal, they all sort of share just a liveliness and a technique and a style that's created by individuals. An actor might be able to create the same emotions through any other kind of abstract form of theater or dance or movement, but it's never going to be the same as an animator creating it in a controlled environment where they can dedicate all the time in the world to really perfecting and creating that character. And they really do develop like certain kind of styles that are particular to that studio. Like going back to the early animated Disney films, if you look at Snow White or something, to me, when I look at all the animals, it doesn't matter what kind of animal it is, it's a puppy dog, basically. You know, the deers and their little wagging tails and stuff. Things that are not really anatomically accurate necessarily to the kind of animal they are, but they're things that people relate to on such a personal level, such a strong emotional level, that it sort of speaks louder than words and louder than reality is really what I'm getting at. And when you get to programmatic animation, I think absolutely that same artistry could exist, but the power at that point is not with the illustrator, at least not with the systems that we see being developed now. The power is with the programmer and the way that they take in information from live actors, from audio, waveforms, or whatever source material they're working with, written word, and how they communicate it on the screen through the personality of the characters presented. And Animoji, I think, does this really well. I mean, you see some of the things where it translates certain movements and expressions and, you know, puts that from an ugly dude like me onto a, you know, cool-looking unicorn or something. I haven't actually used Animoji, but I've seen examples. There's an artistry in that, a creativity, but who has that control? With something like AR emoji, Samsung is playing with giving more of that control to the end user by allowing them to customize their avatar. But even then, they're customizing the visuals and not the movement. And the movement is essentially what the animation is. Without the movement, it's just a picture. If it's just a picture that's moving exactly in real life, then it's more of a photo filter in my mind than it is actually animation in its essence. To me, that's almost not animation. I don't want to sound like a snob. I'm not an animator and I'm not an illustrator or an artist, but to me, that's just at the heart of it, that's not what animation is. Now, again, is something like AR emoji, if you look at those characters, is that ever going to compete with anything that Pixar would do? Not really, but at the same time, it inevitably will compete because it's going to be just so much more prevalent. And if suddenly the animation field grows tenfold because everything's 10 times cheaper, there's 10 times more competition, it's just that much harder for people who are doing it the traditional way to cut through. And I mean, Pixar's already established this incredible brand, and the other studios that I mentioned, they've built this brand that people know and respect, and people know what they're gonna get when they go to see an Aardman film or a Ghibli movie. And that's why, you know, Ghibli isn't doing CGI wisely, right? Because people want traditional animation out of them. So those brands, I think, are safe right now, but what's sort of the next generation of animator? What's the next studio to really evolve the art form, and how will they cut through when, you know, the movie posters and the cast and the marketing and everything else would look totally identical, and it's just the actual technique, it's what's under the hood that's going to be very, very, very different in my mind. You may have seen the last video that I posted on YouTube. I played around with like a really simple, kind of cheesy, basic version of animating lips on still stock photos for my funniest IMDb user review video for Bright. I was really blown away. I mean, that's an old technique. That's existed for 5 years. I've just never played around with it. Now we're on a kind of more sophisticated, ever so slightly more sophisticated animated video series for my channel using Character Animator. And again, just what I've done so far, I'm just sort of shocked at how easy it is. And as great as it is for a creator like me who, you know, it's my opportunity to inhibit a different character or just make videos that are a little bit more unique and kind of express my personality in a different way, for the animation industry as a whole, is it a good thing? I think in the short term, probably not. But again, if we can find a way to basically put the power in the hands of the actual creators at the end of the day, including the programmatic animations, then I think we have a really exciting accelerated workflow that is every bit as good potentially as traditional animation. Because at that point, you know, even if you look at like the rubber hose animators from the 20s, every individual animator would have a different style, a different certain kind of walk cycle that they would be known for, perhaps, or a way that they would move and stretch the character's neck or express or features. And it might be different for every character, but the character has to have some consistency, some continuity anyways to establish their identity. So it makes sense that that would be programmatic. But again, those decisions about how to move that character and bring it to life have to be in the hands of the animator. The animator should not just be an illustrator, but they actually have to be the puppeteer as well. And to use again the Frank Oz example. The Frank Oz situation with Star Wars, I think, shows that there's still a hunger for the old style, right? People still sort of hate CGI. I don't want to go in a debate about CGI versus traditional animation. That's not what I'm talking about here. That's a whole other video. But I think the hunger for the old is sort of the one saving grace, perhaps, for traditional animation. The problem is, how acutely do people actually tune in to the different techniques at play? For example, a lot of CGI now is made to look like claymation, and it actually fools a lot of people, and it's getting better and better all the time. And I have no problem with that. To me, it's just a different look, a different aesthetic. But I can still tell the difference, and I still prefer traditional claymation when I want to see claymation personally. And there will always be people who will be able to tell, like any Pixar animator, for example, I swear, could probably tell you if something is programmatic or what elements of it are animated based on a waveform or a video file versus, you know, truly from scratch. But again, you need the vast majority of an audience for any given film to really recognize and appreciate those differences. And right now, I kind of feel like it's probably just 1 in 10 people who are really going to point out those things and notice them at a conscious level. More people might notice them at an unconscious level, but then how do they justify like the $200 million organically animated film from the one that cost $5 million because it was programmatically created? Anyways, I could go on this topic forever. I want to keep this short. I hope that wasn't too dry. I'm really curious to hear what you guys' thoughts are on Character Animator and AR Emoji and the whole Frank Oz situation and the future of animation in 2018 and beyond. And I absolutely read all of the comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. If you're interested in analysis and the history and the future of the film industry and some of the kind of more quirky aspects of the entertainment world, be sure to subscribe for more videos like this. Thanks again, and I'll catch you guys next time.